what the challenge is that we may end up aviation using up all of those available resources. So synthetic aviation fuel made from power, so what we sometimes call power to liquid, roughly we think if you made all of the world's aviation fuels today using power to liquid, that would use something like 40% of the world's electricity production. That's not 40% of the renewable electricity globally, that's just total electricity production globally. Roughly double that for 2050. So we're talking about electricity production, if you went to 100% synthetic by power solution, that is in the order of magnitude of all of today's global electricity use for all sectors.
Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. I'm Marius, an aerospace engineer passionate about exploring the future of aviation and your host. In today's episode, we are talking about the future of sustainable aviation with a particular focus on a recent report from the Aviation Impact Accelerator. Joining me for the third time in the co-pilot seat is the brilliant Kilian Bartsch, a PhD researcher from the University of Cambridge, specializing in thermal management for hydrogen-powered aircraft. Great to have you back, Kilian.
Thanks, Marius. I'm excited for the discussion.
You're excited for the discussion and probably also for the guest, because our guest today is Dr. Paul Hodgson. And actually, you know him much better than I do, so I leave the introduction to you, Kilian.
Awesome. Yeah. So Paul is based at the same lab as me, the Whittle Lab of the University of Cambridge. And small disclaimer, our work over the past 2 years has had no direct overlap. So this is kind of not my work that we're talking about. So Paul is the technical director of the Aviation Impact Accelerator, also abbreviated often as the AIA. A chemical engineer by training, he joined the AIA in 2020, before which he completed an online MBA and was a co-founder CTO of a hydrogen distribution startup. Paul's earlier research on carbon capture in cement and steel and innovations in biofuel production has become increasingly relevant to climate neutral aviation. He still continues to teach process modeling and synthesis as lecturer and bi-fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge.
Paul, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
Yeah, and great to have you.
Yeah, so Paul, you have such an interesting route into the aviation sector, maybe not the most typical, with chemical engineering background and even having patented separation solutions for potential key intermediates in the alcohol to jet pathway. Is this kind of typical in the Aviation Impact Accelerator? Could you explain to us what the AIA is and how it fits in the aviation value chain? I mean, maybe a bit of a spiky question is, between traditional role of academia and aircraft manufacturers and fuel producers, what can the Aviation Impact Accelerator add in advising like a consultancy or government?
Yeah, so I guess there's a fair amount to unpack there. So perhaps start with what the Aviation Impact Accelerator is. So the AIA is a global initiative that's led jointly by the Whittle Lab in Cambridge and Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, CISL, and brings together experts from across the sector and beyond to accelerate the transition to sustainable flight. Our mission is to develop evidence-based tools and insights to allow decision makers to map and understand the pathways towards sustainable flight. We do this in a number of ways, but at its heart, we've developed what we call holistic systems models that range from what we call resource to climate. So they range from primary energy extraction, energy conversion, fuel production, distribution, how that's operated in airports. New fuels will have to operate airports differently, new aircraft, how those aircraft are designed, how we fly those aircraft, right through to both the CO2 and non-CO2 effects on the system and the other environmental impacts that those may touch upon. And we found that building these models and tools helps us gain insights about how the system behaves. We found that the more and more we've done this, the more we actually have to touch on things on the outside space of aviation. I like to say that aviation's transition is really an energy transition. So whilst there's a lot of excitement looking at kind of designs of new aircraft, for instance, and they play a role in it, I would say they're kind of one role in this, and actually the wider piece is really a big energy transition challenge. Aviation's extremely energy hungry. So for that reason, and for the reason that we look at holistic systems, for instance, my team at the AIA has quite a broad background. For instance, not majority aerospace engineers. We have some aerospace engineers, but as Killian mentioned, there's also chemical engineers such as myself by background and other people from all sorts of different backgrounds outside of engineering as well. In terms of what we have to offer, I hope that things like the report that you've mentioned are kind of useful to people trying to get an overview of the potential next steps for aviation. We found these holistic systems models very powerful in understanding the changes that are required across the whole system, and sometimes can uncover potential or sometimes can assess potential of new technologies, how they might impact the whole system.
You certainly did a really great job in that recent paper to illustrate what are the opportunities and the things that we have to do. And I really can't praise, this report often enough, because not only is it very factual, but you managed to put these facts into really illustrative graphics. So that's really helpful, and you can share them. And also something that we're going to link is not only the paper itself, but also a presentation that you gave alongside Safe Landing, where you showed these graphics. It's a shame we can't show them here on podcast, but we'll try everything to illustrate it with examples. And, when you really spend time on them, you could even find like hidden key fact plots. So if there's any topic that you find interesting, you can click on it, and it's another plot that comes up if you want to dive more into details. So to start off, and set the stage, what are these goals that we have to pursue in order for aviation to be more sustainable?
Yeah, so we had 4 goals that originally came about through a series of transatlantic workshops and the visit that King mentioned with our partners at MIT and transatlantic policy partners. And they outline 4 areas where focus is required to, by 2030, to set us on track for our stated target of sustainable aviation by 2050. Right now, we believe that the aviation industry is probably dangerously off track for that goal. And so there are a number of things that we need to do to act within the next 5 years. So the first goal is what we call Operation Blue Skies. We should immediately launch several airspace scale living labs to enable global contrail avoidance systems to be deployed by 2030. We can unpack those a bit further, but obviously there's lots of fantastic work that's obviously been partly discussed on this show by lots of researchers and industry around the world that have been building towards this. But the next stage, we believe, is that we need those kind of airspace-wide living labs. The second goal is systems efficiency, which is something that's sometimes discussed, but is perhaps often neglected as being sort of less sexy than some of the other solutions. We believe that we need governments and others to set out clear commitments to the market about the intention to drive system-wide efficiency improvements. There are a number of strategies that can be developed beyond just some of the perhaps individual actor efficiency gains that have been previously discussed widely. And we probably need a new attitude or new view on how we tackle system efficiency in light of the immense challenge that sustainable aviation is. The third is around the subject of so-called sustainable aviation fuels, although it's a terminology I don't particularly love. I think kind of discussed before that perhaps synthetic aviation fuels might be a better wording of that acronym. And we talk about, therefore, the need for truly sustainable and scalable fuels. We need to adopt policies that take a cross-sectoral approach. Right now, we've made a lot of progress in some parts of the world with things like SAF mandates or in the kind of initiation of SAFs, still at very, very kind of almost homeopathic quantities in reality. That's obviously true always for new technologies and new fuels. But there is a risk that these fuels, if policies aren't properly managed, could extract resources, particularly renewable biomass and electricity, from other sectors, which could have much greater decarbonisation potential with the same limited resources. And then finally, because obviously by the sounds of it, all of those things are extremely difficult, we also need to invest in potential moonshots. We need, over the next 5 years, to launch several high-reward experimental demonstration programs to enable us to focus on the scale up of the most viable transformation technologies by 2030. In the report, we use hydrogen as an example of this, partly because obviously hydrogen is currently widely researched and widely discussed as a potential aviation future, although the report also talks briefly about other potential moonshots. In all of them, they would require what we call a moonshot level of investment and engagement between now and 2050 for any of them to have a realistic probability of a significant impact in the 2050s, just simply because the timeframes it takes to deliver the scale up of some of these changes.
Yeah. And as anyone can already tell from that, this just shows how big of the scope of this report has been. And so we definitely encourage any listeners to go and check out the report for more detail. We'll only be able to go into so much in this one episode. But one of the big picture takeaways for me of this report is the long time scales involved in aviation. So all of these 4 goals, when you look at the impact, you really start noticing a difference between current trajectories, business as usual, and these higher ambition levels in the 2040s. But a lot of the necessary steps to unlock them are in these next 5 years to achieve the big 2050 goals that are the main focus. And maybe they have a lot of, it's a good first step, but now we really have to go on implementing them in a noticeable way. I was wondering if this window of opportunity and this time where we're looking at this now is really unique, kind of, and we'll look back in 20 years and say, oh, that was one of those key moments where we had these options for aviation to go, or is this kind of a general takeaway for a lot of big projects that there's key steps that we need to focus on to unlock future trajectories, or is this really a unique time in aviation?
I think it's an interesting question. I think I do think if we do successfully achieve sustainable aviation by the 2050s, then I think that the 2020s will likely have been viewed as the genesis of that. And I think we've already seen in the early 2020s a much greater attention to that pathway. I think what we see in things like moonshots is that one of the reasons that we are advocating that we need to launch these experiments demonstrations now is almost that the time is almost out for that scale up by 2050. Of course, it's a bit like investment advice. The best time to invest was yesterday, but the next best time is today. So I think that also holds true in the moonshots. I think if we don't act on most of these, SAFs and moonshots in particular, within the next few years, it doesn't mean those things can never happen, but I think it is it will close off opportunities for the 2050 horizon. So obviously you can just shift the whole time series to the right if you like, but then we will not achieve what we need to meet our international commitments, both within aviation and more broadly as a climate impact.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention that any tipping points could come up, right? I mean, that's not to create any fear, but it's also because those tipping points, could be very damaging also for the aviation industry. So it's in the self-interest to de-risk that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk about, for instance, things like the carbon budget in reference to issues like contrails, because there's sort of an interesting problem when we look often at things like aviation CO2 and non-CO2 that we often, for instance, compare current non-CO2 instantaneous warming to historical warming from CO2 emitted by aviation. But the CO2, this is somewhat of a gambler's fallacy. The CO2 we've already emitted from aviation is already done. We're broadly not really looking at undoing that. We can only deal with what we do in the future. We are dangerously close to our 1.5 degree mark. Some people feel that we may have already broadly reached 1.5 degrees without any major point of return, and clearly storming straight towards 2 degrees. We are likely moving into realms of climate space that we don't fully understand. I think this is a strange thing about uncertainty. I think people often naturally worry about what happens if things are at the bottom end of uncertainty, i.e. if we don't hit some tipping points and therefore maybe some of these things won't be a problem. The thing about uncertainty is it's equally likely to be the top end of the uncertainty as the bottom end of the uncertainty. And so the uncertainty in the future of our climate systems as we add more CO2 to the atmosphere and other radiative forcing effects should worry us, not reassure us that perhaps maybe it's at the lower end of some of these projections.
This brings us to a key point where I always feel that the more consequences of climate change we realize, the more importance gets shifted towards actions that we can do that have a rapid response. And so methane is always kind of used as an example of shorter timescales than CO2. And so as the consequences get worse, we're encouraged to maybe do more on that shorter timescale. And contrails are obviously the extreme example of that, which brings us to the first goal, which I love the framing of this. Operation Blue Skies. It has this very kind of visual aspect to it. And I was hearing this one person say the biggest problem why we haven't dealt with CO2 is because humans can't see it, right? And so it's a very intangible, non-visible things. And contrails have this amazing aspect that everyone has seen them in the skies, everyone knows what they look like, and it's so much easier to verify and say, hey, look, I can see that plane did one, this plane didn't. So the Operation Blue Skies that you present in this report really pushes the urgency of doing airspace scale tests. And so one of the interesting analogies that I took away from reading this is the comparison with medical trials of like randomized controlled trials that happen, where obviously you want to check that medicine works on individual humans, but you have to make sure that the counterfactual is right, and you don't have lab humans that you can just manage to expense. And this is very similar to the case in aviation, where a lot of people are pushing back against trials because we don't know what if the impact is worse or something. But as you very well highlight in this first goal, the importance of inaction also needs to be quantified. And so what do you think the aviation sector can really learn from this RCT, randomized controlled trial approach of the medical field or epidemiology? Because aviation isn't used to doing this.
Yeah, so this framing around a comparison to epidemiological or medical trials actually comes from some of your previous guests. Mark Stettler and Stephen Barrett talked about this a lot. I'm sure I've talked previously about this on this show. Yes, there is significant uncertainty as to the impact of contrails, and then particularly, we present in the report some of the uncertainty around how impactful the scale up of avoiding contrails may be through navigational avoidance. Clearly, we need to run trials in a manner in which we can rely on the results. And so we've outlined 4 qualities of those airspace living labs that are required in order to give us that confidence that the system actually works in the real world. We call those distribution, scale, quality, and review. We think we need 3 or 4 living labs around the world. That's partly because there are different airspace policies in place in different parts of the world. There's different climatic effects in different parts of the world and different regulatory landscapes. So it's likely that one is probably insufficient for a global set of systems. The second is the scale does need to be large enough to replicate real world complexities of both kind of air traffic control, network effects, and the knock-on effect of moving one aircraft into another. That's not something we've really seen in any what we've called previous contrail trials. I would say probably the terminology to not confuse it with, say, medical trials is probably more experiments. They've been on, say, individual flights or a handful of individual flights. The closest we've probably seen to this is the MUAC trial. The third, in terms of quality, that there is a number of steps that we really must take to give us scientific confidence that what we're doing is working. And so some of that is some of the scale actually helps with this to give us statistical significance. But we also need the independent verification in the sense that, for instance, we need both, one of the challenges with contrail avoidance is it's much easier to detect the formation of contrails than it is to detect the absence of contrails being formed. As Killian said, you can see contrails formed, you can't see contrails not being formed. And so for the purpose of trials, we'll likely need things like control aircraft, for instance, to detect that we, in fact, would have formed contrails had we not avoided a given region. And then finally, obviously, we need a relatively open review process where we share data and we can have peer review and oversight, for instance, from independent NGOs, so that everyone can be confident in the results of these trials. So I think those are very critical. I don't think we're advocating, for instance, that we just go out and implement contrail avoidance without just on the basis of trust or any such systems. I think it's probably also worth stressing that in big challenges like this, I think that you do a lot of learning by doing. Most experimentalists in the lab will tell you that as they build and develop their experiments, they learn an awful lot more than what they thought when they were trying to sketch out their experiments in their notepads. And I think that these airspace living labs, there are lots of gaps in our understanding as how we could operationalize, or even how contrail avoidance might necessarily work. But I think we do need these airspace-wide trials in order to learn what we don't know as well as what we do know.
Paul, could you maybe give us a little bit of a context how you would conduct these airspace trials? Maybe even put it in the comparison of MUAC, but just to understand how it would work and whether it would be led from ANSPs, airlines, or what even the role of governments would be in that. But maybe you can just outline a little bit these labs.
Of course. I mean, I think I should probably preface with the fact that it's probably not organizations like the Aviation Impact Accelerator that would be running the technology development or potentially like running these sorts of trials. There is already lots of fantastic work and lots of your previous guests who are actively working on a number of things that are precursors or could become airspace-wide living labs. I think that we feel that the likely areas, if I was to kind of pick 4 areas in the world where we perhaps would need to instigate these, would be somewhere in European airspace, North Atlantic airspace, North American airspace, and possibly something in the Pacific, maybe around Japan area. That those kind of cover off most of the contrail hotspots. And all, for various reasons, have quite different airspace issues, different control issues, etc. So I think they kind of represent a reasonable selection. These could be government-led in the sense that governments could instigate these trials. It could be industry becomes sufficiently coalesced. I do think there are some real challenges for industry in directly coalescing this without some form of bodies to assist in that. That's partly because both contrail operation and contrail trials cost money in the form of potentially the additional fuel burn from aircraft, but also just the additional human capacity in running things. And that's a real challenge in voluntary systems, because we already know some of the airlines that are running contrail trials. Whilst they're doing it because they believe it's the right thing, the benefit is more for society or for the industry as a whole. There's obviously some learning for them as individual airlines, but they're looking around to their left and right and seeing that airline B is maybe not participating, and that's a lower cost to airline B, and they're obviously commercial ventures. So I think that could become a challenge. It's not necessarily unovercomable, but so for that reason, it may be that governments leading some of these trials, or perhaps delegating that down to national air traffic control levels, may be a way to run these. In terms of scale, I think this is something for some of the people that looked at some of the technical details in these, but broadly, I think they would need to be airspaces of hundreds of kilometers across, and periods of time of perhaps in the order of at least weeks, if not months. This is to try and deal with one of the issues I think probably has been previously discussed, which is monitoring contrails for individual airlines or individual flights is quite tricky. It may be easier to demonstrate contrail avoidance on an airspace-wide scale. So we can monitor the cloud formation by satellite, for instance, over an airspace, and determine that, yes, thanks to the mitigation measures we've taken, the contrail cloud coverage that has been formed in this airspace is less than we'd expect for this typical month or these typical weeks in this year. Now, obviously, you need a large enough area and a large enough number of flights and a large enough time to be able to make that statistical correlation. But that's one of the reasons that airspace-wide trials is essential.
So just to reiterate, it is difficult and there's a high uncertainty when it comes to predicting one flight in terms of, the persistent warming contrails that come out of that and its impact. But it gets easier if you just monitor a space, because then you don't have to be as good in the attribution, right, of the clouds that come out of that, of the contrail forcing that comes out of that. So it would be an argument actually to do the trial in a certain area. You said even hundreds of kilometers, And I think that's an important point to stress here, because it could be a way to approach this, I am saying, chicken egg problem, because the reason is that you don't want to do trials because there's not enough certainty, but then again, the trials would lead to more certainty, right? So do you think that there is, by maybe promoting this aspect of, a collective effort and an airspace kind of trial, do you think that there is also the chance to get more airlines on board to do this?
Potentially. I think also it may give some more buy-in to airlines, because I do see a big reluctance in the industry to either overly publicly discuss the issues of contrails, or resistance, for instance, the MRV framework, where blame sort of ends up being apportioned down to individual airline or individual flight level. And whilst we don't have contrail avoidance schemes effectively available to airlines, the reality is, other than not flying, airlines currently don't have any tools to avoid contrails, and so effectively it's slightly random which airlines have contrail formation and which ones don't right now. By putting it at an airspace level, this, I think, may remove some of the individual fear or pressure on airlines to move this to be much more of an industry problem, or actually really what it is, which is a climate problem, as opposed to ending up accepting responsibility for sort of individual flights and the kind of randomness of whether contrails formed on airline A's flight or airline's B flight, just through the machinations of the weather moving around on those particular days. So it may give more buy-in, because I can see this big fear for airlines that once they start attributing contrails on every individual flight, then that will sort of place that responsibility upon them. I should say that I obviously believe that there is a response. The airlines do have a responsibility for this climate impact, but in terms of moving us to a system where we can all move together, I think looking at airspace wide may help with that problem.
Just a follow-up question on this, because I had a couple of representatives from software providers or flight planning software providers, and my feeling is that they would argue against what you just said, because if I understand it correctly, you said that the only thing that airlines could do nowadays to avoid contrails would be not to fly, whereas there are some players who say that they have this function in production, saying that it could be done today. Is this something that the research is not really aware of at this point, or are there actually limitations that you see in these software solutions, or are these software solutions based on models which don't have enough certainty? Maybe you could untangle that statement a little bit.
Yeah, I should clarify that there are definitely some solution providers, both in research and commercial, that are either doing forecasting and then reflight planning, and or doing some degree of tactical avoidance systems. So, for instance, some of Stephen Barrett and MIT's work and Google's work has looked at using satellites to detect live contrail formation and tactically then rediverting flights to avoid those regions. And those obviously help give us some degree of verification about individual aircraft level. However, I'm not sure that we've really seen those be proven to the public in a very open trial sense, in the sense that there obviously have been trials of lots of those systems, but I'm not sure they would necessarily pass. They may pass, but we haven't run things like the airspace-wide living labs to demonstrate their efficacy. It would be fantastic if they already were working, because it would make the job much easier, right? If we could test some of these solution providers at an airspace-wide scale, and they work, and we can verify they work with the kind of quality and review portions of that proposal, then our job is easy, because we already have the solutions in a deployable sense. But I don't think we're quite there. I think there are lots of challenges with forecast. I think there may be, in learning and doing this, we may find some halfway houses, such as looking at scheduling of flights around kind of times of day that have stronger contrails, or whether there's forecasting on a kind of statistical basis in certain regions that works better than others. But at the moment, I think it's kind of early days on that piece.
All right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking with friends also, and they were arguing about the best way to mitigate one's own flight. And one friend was saying, like, hey, maybe I should just book a flight that leaves in the morning, because then I'm sure that if it forms a contrail, it will be during the day. And that's kind of the best thing that we can do now. And yeah, the travel impact model of Google and the ICCT is trying to find a way to see, is there anything actionable that can be done by an individual at the stage of booking, which is a very hard problem to crack. But I'm going to move us on now to another really interesting topic that is discussed a lot in industry, and it's alternative aviation fuels, where, as you guys call it in the report, truly sustainable and scalable fuel. One thing that I found really interesting looking at the big main graph of this goal is that compared to business as usual, the current trajectory of SAF goals and rollout has a risk of being even worse than just the stick with maybe a few more new aircraft and just using fossil fuel. This is to do with the balancing of limited electricity and biomass and looking at the full scope of aviation's impact. So aviation as part of the global system, not just an industry in isolation. Can you unpack this a bit more for us? How can it be that our current trajectory could be worse than just sticking to fossil jet fuel? And what are the risks associated?
Yes, it's a great question, and it's really counterintuitive when we use the terminology of sustainable aviation fuels, because I get a lot of, well, how can sustainable aviation fuels be less sustainable than something that's not labeled as sustainable? And as you explained, this comes down to the fact that when we look at the life cycle assessment of SAFs, we are talking generally about the in-sector reductions. So subject to suitable life cycle analysis controls and suitable restrictions on type of feedstocks, which actually aren't always applied. So we should be also wary of that, but sometimes are applied. The emissions for the aviation sector do go down using SAF, as lots of roadmaps predict. The challenge comes in that we do not have an unlimited supply of either renewable biomass or renewable electricity. Both are extremely limited today and actually probably will remain relatively limited over the coming decades. And what the challenge is that we may end up aviation using up all of those available resources. So as a small example, synthetic aviation fuel made from power, so what we sometimes call power to liquid, roughly we think if you made all of the world's aviation fuels today using power to liquid, that would use something like 40% of the world's electricity production. That's not 40% of the renewable electricity globally, that's just total electricity production globally.
And that's of today's or of 2050's electricity?
That's today. It's roughly double that for 2050. So We're talking about electricity production, if you went to 100% synthetic by power solution, that is in the order of magnitude of all of today's global electricity use for all sectors. On the biomass side, we hear a lot of discussion, for instance, about the fact that, well, as road weans its way off biofuels and electrifies, then we can use all those biofuels as well. I think, firstly, that underestimates how long all of those road fuels are going to take to transition over. But total liquid biofuel output today is in the order of 4 exajoules. So it would make up maybe just under 30% of aviation fuels if all of that was converted to aviation fuels, which is also technically not possible today because the way we would convert those fuels mean that we've maybe half of it at most would end up as jet fuel and a bunch of the rest would end up as different fuels because we don't have selective jet fuel routes. So we're talking in the order of less than 10% of 2050's demand, even if we converted all of that. So there clearly are extreme pressures on the resource available. The illustrative example I like to use with this is perhaps with hydrogen. So if you take a unit of green hydrogen and use it to make fake dinosaur juice, you'll get about half a unit of fake dinosaur juice. So you'll displace about half a unit of fossil fuel. If you take the same unit of green hydrogen and use it to displace grey hydrogen made from fossil fuel, you'll displace about 1.5 units of fossil fuel instead of using fossil fuel to make hydrogen. And today, hydrogen is 99% grey and black. So it's basically all fossil, very similar to the aviation industry. In fact, it's about the same size as the aviation industry. They're both about 450 gigawatts. Hydrogen and jet fuel today use about the same. And so until you've displaced an industry the size of grey hydrogen, which we need to power things like ammonia and glass and a lot of other chemical products that we absolutely non-negotiably need to feed and shelter the earth, you actually don't really genuinely have much hydrogen left over for aviation. So the net effect of taking green hydrogen from the system, if you don't put in things like additionality clauses, where we say that aviation must invest in its own additional renewable electricity and electrolyzers, means that you're reducing aviation's fossil fuel demand in exchange for a much higher overall fossil fuel demand in other sectors. And the climate really doesn't care about this sector by sector approach. The climate only cares about total CO2. It doesn't care about what CO2 molecules we've labeled up arbitrarily with aviation and with other sectors. This is an immense challenge. It's not something that aviation can tackle on its own. We need to have, in particular for biomass, a much more structured approach to looking at the competition between sectors to make sure that some of these effects don't happen. There are a number of things we can do both in sector and collaboration to reduce some of these impacts, but it requires careful consideration.
And the next level of this analogy where you were saying 1 unit of green hydrogen, presumably replacing jet fuel, only gets a half a unit and you get 1.5 for reducing gray hydrogen, would be to then look at, well, if I hadn't even created hydrogen in the first place, how many units of fossil fuel could I replace by power an electric car or turning off a fossil fuel electricity plant, which is presumably even higher than that 1.5?
Absolutely. If you go to say, if you take your example of, say, a unit of renewable electricity, that'll make about a third of a unit of fake dinosaur juice, but it can displace about 3 units of fossil fuel in, say, an electric vehicle. So the ratios can get as high as 10 to 1, depending on your kind of analogy. I should note that aviation is actually not that unfamiliar with this concept, but we only apply it to land. So today, in most of our life cycle assessments, including in, for instance, CORSIA, which is the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme run by ICAO, which includes SAFs and the life cycle assessment mechanism for SAFs. We have this effect called indirect land use change. This is where we recognize the fact that if, for instance, a farmer changes his field from, say, one kind of food crop to a biofuel crop, then whilst the land emissions at that farm haven't changed, given that we still need to feed everybody, it is likely that there is a indirect and slightly not directly measurable effect that somewhere else someone will have to produce more food, and that likely will lead to, for instance, some deforestation in a different region in order to produce that food. And so we account for this indirect land use change effect in our life cycle assessments when looking at land-based fuels. The issue is that we only apply that to land-based fuels. We don't apply it to other biomass waste fuels or to electric fuels in the same way. So effectively, one potential way around this is to account for induced resource use change impacts.
Yeah, that's a big important thing and needs to be included because, for example, in EU legislation right now, that's the only thing that considered this, what would have been the alternative land use. One other really interesting point that I want to highlight in this report was the requirement to future-proof almost the SAF plants. Like there's SAF plants being built and invested in today for today's expectations, which are very limited and pushed towards bringing down the cost. But then in the long term, the expectations of what we expect these SAF plants to do will kind of change. And so you guys look into ensuring that the location has potential for this to improve a bit. Like, is it located close to suitable geology locations where we could capture and store the CO2, or is it in a location where there's a high potential for renewable energy production? If we think of this requirement of additionality, I always think that maybe the most important thing is actually how flexible these SAF plants can be, rather than having highly efficient, very capital intensive plants. Maybe the most important thing of a SAF plant is that it can make the most of renewable electricity on the grid, and that the additionality shouldn't just be, does this plant have solar panels on it and wind turbines nearby it, but actually how can it adapt to a grid that has a higher renewable electricity permeation in it? Is that something that also feels sensible, or how could we say afterwards that plant had a lot of additional electricity versus another one that doesn't?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of just purely the additionality piece, the EU, for instance, has rules on additionalities, particularly for some other sectors. So that there are some well-established mechanisms for demonstrating additionality. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to use, say, off-grid renewables, you just can't just sort of take the net grid and take the net grid emissions and sort of say, well, it doesn't matter what time I use the power versus what was being generated on the grid. You need to do some kind of time matching onto the grid, etc. So there are mechanisms for that. But I think you're absolutely right that the flexibility of plants, and we outline a few ways in which plants can be relatively carbon efficient, for instance, which minimizes their biomass demand. So, for instance, on a pure biofuel, most of the time we throw about 2/3 of the carbon up the flue in the plant. So only about 1/3 of that renewable carbon that's in the biomass ends up in the fuel. The remainder goes up the flue stack in the SAF plant. And that's because jet fuel is a lot more energy dense than a tree. So there are a number of mechanisms. One, as Kelly mentioned, was carbon capture. We could simply bury that other 2/3 of CO2, which was biogenic CO2, and so therefore is effectively a negative emission. We could upgrade that CO2 with additional hydrogen made from renewable power, or we can work in synergy, for instance, with other sectors that are potentially producing biogenic CO2. So there's a number of things that we can do. I think the flexibility point is really important. I think one of the reasons we're setting this out now is that as we start developing SAF plants, we need to think forward for the time when we're going to start running out of biomass and may need to be more carbon efficient than we are today, or that carbon capture facilities may come on stream. And I think that flexibility is also just important because I think we overstate how mature SAF technology actually is. There are a couple of SAF routes that are relatively commercialized, in particular HEFA, but most SAF routes aren't commercial today. And so we don't quite know what feedstocks will work out and what routes will work out. And so there is an importance of flexibility in that. And then the final thing I'd add is there are, in terms of this flexibility, the EU have outlined some good schemes on this with, for instance, recycled carbon fuels. For instance, they've said that it's okay to take fossil CO2 from say, fossil emitters and use those in synthetic plants until 2040. But the EU has been very clear that beyond 2040, this will not be allowed because clearly that isn't possible in a net zero world. We can't take fossil CO2 and even if it goes via another process, put it out through the back of aircraft engines. And this applies to fossil CO2, but it also applies to non-biogenic feedstocks like half, roughly, of municipal solid waste. I think it's kind of important that we look at that now because most of the SAF plants we're building today will be around in 2050. So we really need to think carefully about SAF plants that are actually going to be sustainable in 2050, not just what we can make a life cycle assessment case for today based on some counterfactuals.
Awesome. Yeah. And one of the key things in this report is that there's so many little other sections of other solutions that are kind of less discussed. Two of the ones that jumped out to me that you might want to mention a bit more or talk about another one is synthetic biology. Rather than doing power to liquid, can we kind of train an organism to create these longer chain hydrocarbons from biomass feedstock? And this low aromatic fossil fuel kerosene combined with carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal of maybe that's the most energy intensive way rather than taking carbon out of the air and trying to produce an e-fuel of it. Just use fossil fuel that you try to reduce aromatic content to reduce non-CO2 effects and then combine that with. Is there anything you want to mention in specific of why these haven't gotten more attention or are these just too far-fetched?
So the first, I think, is kind of really a bit of a moonshot in technology. I think one thing that's under-discussed in most SAF technologies is this selectivity problem. The vast majority of SAF routes don't just produce jet fuel. Jet fuel itself is a bit of a jumble of different chain lengths, and crude oil is a big, massive jumble of different chain lengths. Most of our processes don't make jet fuel. They make a big jumble of chain lengths that we then pull out, the ones that look like kerosene. Now, the potential synthetic biology is that you could take the kind of raw feedstocks, the easiest feedstocks we can deal with. So that could be CO2 and electrons, or it could be, some of the kind of waste biomass feed streams, and selectively carve those into jet fuel chain lengths, because thermochemical catalysts are quite bad at knowing when to stop growing chains, but biological species are very good at selectively producing species because of the way that they work. Now, this would have been previously very challenging, but the leaps and bounds in synthetic biology have been enormous over the last couple of decades. And so I think that's, if we want to bank some money in R&D to see if there's some potential, it feels like an area where, the SAF transition is a multi-trillion-dollar transition. And so, investments of some hundreds of millions into something that might make that transition a lot easier seems like a kind of sound bet to me. The second is, I think, not explored for a different reason. I actually think it's something that will come back around, which is, as you say, to make fossil jet fuel as cleanly as you can and remove some of the species you don't really want in the long run, like aromatics. So right now, about 20% of our emissions are just upstream processing of jet fuel, i.e. getting out of the ground and refining into jet fuel. We currently use fossil fuels to do that. We don't have to use fossil fuels to do that. And so we could reduce the emissions of aviation by about 20% by just eliminating upstream emissions. And that's certainly a lot easier than making the whole fuel. Similarly, then, offsetting the remaining fossil CO2 with, for instance, direct air capture and storage or some kind of bio CO2 capture and storage is certainly an awful lot less energetically intensive than either biofuels or synthetic fuels. There is a slight perverse thing with PTL DAC, which is we take CO2 from DAC, which is in very short supply, and then add about 10 times more energy just to turn it into a fuel and then re-emit it, as opposed to just taking that CO2 and shoving it in the hole. I think the reasons that we haven't really hammered this one as hard is much more political. When we discuss this, I think people are naturally either skeptical or have an aversion to doing something like offsetting fossil emissions through CO2 storage. So I think it'll come back around when people realize how expensive some of the other solutions are.
And the political aspect perfectly leads to the tradition in the podcast where one speaker or guest passes on a question to the next. And as you know, our previous guest was Mark Stettler. And the political aspect, I mean, he asked the question about carrots and sticks, where carrots, are incentives for acting in a certain direction, and sticks are penalties that you would apply if you act wrongly. And in terms of sustainable aviation, how do you see the balance? What do you think are good approaches to applying carrots and stick in the industry?
One of the key examples that he highlighted was that we had previously assumed that airlines advertising, like, oh, look how much SAF I've bought or how many contrail tries I've done, would get them public approval and maybe even a marketing advantage. But now the balance with greenwashing there is very delicate. And so a lot of airlines are now maybe less incentivized to do this. Can we still give a big carrot to the industry?
I think it's a great question for Mark, and I know he has some of his own views on this. And I think we could probably spend an entire episode purely on this question. I think that the greenwashing question is an interesting one. I actually think there's just a more boring underlying issue with that I actually just don't think the vast majority of the flying public will willingly pay substantially more for sustainable aviation. I mean, there's been a number of studies conducted looking at this, but most of them conclude whilst there is a small proportion of the flying public that are very willing to pay more, if airlines can reliably prove that what they're doing reduces emissions, the vast majority are extremely kind of price sensitive from airline A to airline B. So I'm actually not sure that's actually an enormous carrot for the airlines. I think we have to look at this from a perspective of capitalist democracies. If we're looking at kind of carrots and sticks, I think looking at other things maybe skews that slightly. Aviation decarbonisation or aviation sustainability is an extremely policy-rich problem. And that's because I don't see long-term solutions that can likely economically outcompete the incumbent of fossil jet fuel. I think that all of these solutions will cost more than fossil jet fuel for the foreseeable future. So this is not like transitions, say, in the road industry, where we need initial R&D investment to get over some economic hump. But in the long run, we expect the new technologies to actually just economically outcompete the incumbent. And that means that any policies that we enact effectively need to be permanent. And I think that puts a very different complexion on the carrots, because there's really only two funders for sustainable aviation: the taxpayer or the consumer. There's no slack really in the airlines to pay for this. That their margins are already razor thin, and even if with real margins that sometimes they have, they're just nowhere near the costs involved here. So there's only two real funders for this. And like a lot of people, I believe in the polluter pays principle. So I believe that that cost needs to be trickled down to the consumer. I'm not sure there's a strong case for the taxpayer to be subsidizing what is a relatively small proportion of the population globally flying. It's about 10% of the global population steps on an airplane in any given year, and obviously it's highly skewed towards the wealthy end of the spectrum. I also think we mix up what we're trying to do with carrots. I think there are some really important carrots that we can be applying in sustainable aviation. Things like moonshots or, getting SAF plants off the ground. These are technologies really that aren't fully commercialized. In our capitalist systems, we cannot take, businesses cannot take some of those risks. The shareholders and investors will never allow it. And banks currently can't underwrite some of that because it's too risky for them as well. And so things like revenue certainty mechanisms or, underwritten loans and guarantees, etc., maybe carrots that are required to get some of that off the ground. So there are some important carrots. I think in order to make things like sustainable aviation fuel stick for the long run, you'll need sticks. I just don't think things like IRA are sustainable in the long run. Yeah, and I think we muddle up what we're trying to achieve with lots of carrots. Often the argument is made that aviation needs subsidizing in the case of SAFs because aviation is a force for good, and it really is a force for good. But we're mixing up two different things there. Who pays for sustainable aviation with equitable access to aviation? If we as a society believe that we want to improve access to aviation, divorce that from decarbonization policy, put policy in place. For instance, I know Killian, for instance, has benefited from what is effectively nationally subsidized rail travel around Europe. And we often do this particularly for young people to kind of get them traveling. I think there's an enormous value to that. But we can do that in aviation, but let's not mix that up with decarbonization costs. They're two different issues. So I truly believe aviation is a huge force for good. And ironically, a lot of the people advocating on demand measures have personally benefited enormously from aviation. So I think that aviation is a big force for good, but we shouldn't mix that up with the cost of decarbonization.
Great. And you also have the chance to pass on the ball. We had a quick discussion today about the maturity of the solutions by providers out there, right? When it comes to operators being able to do contrail management. And our next guest will be Frank Opel from the company Pace. What is your question?
Okay, so I know Frank works on a range of flight operation issues and not just climate-related ones, but I think it's really interesting to try and read the pulse of how real people in industry feel about the transition. And that's because ultimately all companies or organizations are actually made up of the people who work for them. So I think kind of everyone's view on this is really interesting. So I'd like to ask Frank whether he believes that the aviation industry is prepared to do what it takes to achieve its goals and obligations to become climate neutral by 2050. Consequences be damned, or are efforts driven by a fear of reductions to growth projections in a future climate conscious world, or perhaps something else entirely?
I'd say it's a heavy question, but there's no such thing as a heavy question here on this podcast. So thanks for that. We'll do our best to pass it on. And let's wrap up quickly here. Guys, this was amazing. It was a great interview. Kilian, thanks a lot for co-piloting this.
Thank you.
And Paul, obviously, thanks for being a guest.
No, it's been interesting discussions. It's been really fantastic to talk.
Likewise. So thanks to both of you and speak soon.
Great. Bye.
Bye.